Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into one of history's deadliest fashion trends. Forget toxic makeup or dangerous corsets. We're talking about shoes. Yes, shoes that could literally kill you. And before you think I'm joking, stick around because what you're about to learn will make you grateful for every boring, comfortable pair of sneakers you own. But first, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's strangest and most dangerous moments, hit that like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the most uncomfortable shoes you've ever worn were. Trust me, they've got nothing on what we're about to explore. Now picture this. You're living in medieval Europe sometime around the 1300s. You've got money, status, and power. But how do you show it off? Jewelry? Sure. Fine clothes? Obviously. But the real symbol of your wealth and importance? Your shoes. Specifically, shoes with points so long and sharp they could be classified as weapons. Welcome to the world of Polanes, the most dangerous fashion statement in human history. These weren't just uncomfortable shoes. They were death traps disguised as footwear. And for over 300 years, the wealthy elite of Europe wore them with pride, even as they stumbled, fell, and sometimes died because of them. So dim the lights, get comfortable in your normal, safe shoes, and let's walk through the twisted history of fashion that prioritized status over survival. Because once you see what people were willing to do to their feet in the name of style, you'll never complain about a tight shoe again. Number 1. The fashion obsession. Congratulations, you've just been born into a wealthy medieval family in 14th century Europe. Your parents aren't peasants scraping by on turnips and prayer. You've got land, servants, and enough gold to buy comfort. But here's the thing about medieval comfort. It comes with a price. And that price is paid in blood, broken bones, and feet so deformed they barely look human anymore. See, when you're rich in medieval times, you can't just wear a nice outfit and call it a day. Everyone with money wears nice outfits. You need something more. Something that screams, I am so wealthy and powerful that I can afford to be completely impractical. Enter the Polane, a shoe so ridiculous, it makes modern high fashion look reasonable. The Polane gets its name from Poland, where these pointed shoes supposedly originated. But by the time they hit Western Europe, they had evolved into something far more extreme than their Polish ancestors. These weren't just shoes with pointy toes. These were architectural marvels of impracticality, engineered to make walking a challenge and running nearly impossible. Picture a normal shoe. Now imagine stretching the toe out until it's longer than your forearm. The point is so sharp it could be used to spear fish. The tip curls upward like a medieval elf slipper, except elves probably had better sense than to actually wear these things. The leather is dyed in rich colors, deep reds, royal blues, forest greens, because if you're going to cripple yourself with footwear, at least do it in style. But here's where it gets really twisted. The wealthy didn't just wear Polanes because they looked exotic or expensive. They wore them because they were completely, utterly, magnificently useless. Think about it. If you're wearing shoes that make it hard to walk, you're sending a message to everyone around you. I don't need to walk anywhere quickly. I don't need to run. I don't need to work with my hands or feet because I have people to do everything for me. It was the ultimate flex. While peasants wore practical leather boots that helped them work in fields, the rich wore shoes that announced to the world that they never had to work at all. The more impractical your shoes, the more obvious it was that you could afford to be helpless. And the wealthy absolutely loved being helplessly fashionable. They would spend fortunes on a single pair of Polanes, having them custom-made by the finest shoemakers in Europe. The leather had to be perfect, the stitching flawless, the points mathematically precise. Some wealthy nobles owned dozens of pairs in different colors, different lengths, different levels of absurdity. The obsession wasn't just about the shoes themselves. It was about the entire lifestyle they represented. When you wore Polanes, you needed servants to help you put them on. You needed someone to steady you when you walked. You needed a horse or a litter to carry you any significant distance because walking more than a few steps was genuinely difficult. But the medieval rich didn't see this as a problem. They saw it as the point. Every stumble, every awkward step, every moment of helplessness was proof that they had transcended the need for basic human functionality. They had become living symbols of wealth, even if those symbols couldn't actually walk properly. And this wasn't a brief fad that lasted a few months. The Polane obsession gripped Europe for over 3 centuries. Generations of wealthy people grew up thinking that torturing their feet was the height of sophistication. Fathers passed down their love of pointed shoes to their sons. Mothers taught their daughters that suffering for fashion was a noble pursuit. By the height of the poulain craze, it wasn't enough to just own a pair. You had to own the most extreme pair possible. The longest points, the most elaborate decorations, the most impossible to walk in design. Because in medieval high society, if your shoes weren't actively endangering your life, you weren't trying hard enough. The fashion had become an arms race of impracticality. And like all arms races, it was about to spiral completely out of control. Number 2. The longer, the better. Now that you understand the basic obsession, let's talk about where this madness actually went. Because the medieval wealthy didn't just settle for shoes with slightly longer points than normal. They turned poulain construction into a competitive sport where the prize was social status and the penalty for losing was being ignored at court. In the early days of poulain fashion, we're talking about the 1300s, a long point might extend 3 or 4 inches past your actual toes. Mildly ridiculous, but still walkable if you were careful. But here's the thing about fashion trends, they never stay reasonable. They escalate. They compete. They push boundaries until those boundaries don't exist anymore. By the 1400s, wealthy Europeans were wearing shoes with points that stretched 6 inches, 8 inches, even 12 inches beyond their feet. Imagine trying to walk with a foot-long spike attached to each shoe. Now imagine doing it while wearing heavy medieval clothing, walking on uneven cobblestone streets, and trying to maintain the dignity expected of your noble status. But 12 inches wasn't the limit. It was just the beginning. The truly wealthy, the ones who wanted to demonstrate that they had more money than sense, commissioned poulains with points that reached 18 inches, 20 inches, even 2 feet long. These weren't shoes anymore. They were elaborate foot torture devices crafted by skilled artisans who probably questioned their career choices every single day. A 2-foot point means your shoe extends from your heel to somewhere around your chest when you're standing up. Try to imagine the physics involved in walking with these things. Every step requires you to lift your foot high enough to clear the ground, then carefully place it down without catching the point on a rock, a crack in the pavement, or another person's equally ridiculous footwear. So the most extreme poulains were so long they had to be supported by chains or cords that attached the tips to the wearer's knees or belts. Yes, you read that right. These people were essentially chaining their shoes to their bodies just to keep from tripping over their own feet every few seconds. The shoes had become so impractical that they required additional equipment just to make walking theoretically possible. But wait, it gets worse. The wealthy weren't content with just making their shoes longer. They made them more elaborate. Some poulains featured bells attached to the tips that jingled with every step. Others were decorated with jewels, precious metals, or intricate embroidery that cost more than most people earned in a year. The message was clear. Not only can I afford to cripple myself with footwear, I can afford to make that footwear incredibly expensive. The longest recorded poulains reached lengths of over 2.5 feet. Picture this, you're at a medieval feast, trying to walk to your seat at the high table, and your shoes extend more than 30 inches in front of your actual feet. You can't see where you're going because your own footwear is blocking your view. You can't turn corners easily because your shoes are wider than most doorways. You can't even sit down normally because the points of your shoes stick out so far that they knock over furniture, trip servants, or poke other guests. And here's the truly insane part. The wealthy love this chaos. The more disruption your shoes caused, the more attention you got. Every stumble was a reminder of your wealth. Every time a servant had to help you navigate a staircase, everyone watching was reminded that you could afford servants. Every broken vase knocked over by your shoe points was evidence that you had so much money that property damage was irrelevant. The competitive aspect became ritualized. At court gatherings, nobles would subtly compare the length of their poulains. Whispered conversations would circulate about who was wearing the longest points, who had commissioned the most elaborate designs, who was taking the biggest risks with their footwear. It was like a medieval version of Keeping Up with the Joneses, except instead of buying bigger houses, they were slowly destroying their feet. Some wealthy individuals became famous specifically for their extreme poulains. Historical records mention nobles known throughout Europe for their absurdly long shoe points, traveling from court to show off their foot-based fashion statements. They were celebrities of impracticality, renowned for their commitment to being magnificently, dangerously, ridiculously fashionable. But here's the thing about pushing any trend to its absolute limit. Eventually, physics fights back. And physics doesn't care how much money you have or how noble your bloodline is. When you're wearing shoes that are essentially medieval ski boots with spikes, the laws of balance, gravity, and common sense are going to win every single time. The wealthy were about to learn this lesson the hard way. Number 3. Walking nightmares. Alright, so you've got your custom-made pole lanes. They cost more than a house. The points are 2 feet long and decorated with gold thread. You look absolutely ridiculous, which in medieval fashion terms means you look absolutely perfect. Now comes the fun part, actually trying to move around in these things. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. Let's start with the basics. Walking. You know, that thing humans have been doing successfully for millions of years? Yeah, pole lanes made that nearly impossible. Every step becomes a calculated risk. You have to lift your feet higher than normal to clear the ground, which throws off your center of balance. The extended points catch on every uneven surface, every loose stone, every slightly raised edge of a cobblestone. Medieval streets weren't exactly smooth pavement. They were rough, uneven, often muddy or icy, filled with holes, loose stones, and various forms of medieval debris that we don't want to think too hard about. Now imagine navigating that obstacle course while wearing shoes that extend 2 feet in front of your actual feet, points so sharp they could be used as weapons, and materials so rigid that your feet can't bend naturally. The wealthy quickly discovered that normal walking was impossible. They developed what historians call the pole lane shuffle, awkward, sliding gait where you barely lift your feet off the ground, moving forward in tiny, careful steps while trying not to catch your shoe points on anything. It looked exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Imagine trying to walk while wearing skis, except the skis are pointed straight up and attached to your feet. But the problems went way beyond looking silly. The real danger came from falling. And oh, did people fall? When you're wearing shoes that throw off your entire center of gravity, every misstep becomes a potential disaster. Trip over your own pole lanes, and you're going down hard. The long points make it impossible to catch yourself properly, and the rigid construction means your feet can't adjust to save your balance. Medieval physicians reported an epidemic of injuries directly related to pole lane wearing. Broken wrists from trying to break falls. Twisted ankles from catching shoe points in cobblestones. Dislocated shoulders from awkward tumbles. Head injuries from face planting because you couldn't see your own feet past the ridiculous points of your shoes. One particularly gruesome account from a medieval chronicler describes a wealthy merchant who caught his pole lane point in a crack between cobblestones, pitched forward, and broke his nose so badly that he was permanently disfigured. Another tells of a noble lady whose elaborate pole lanes got tangled in her dress, causing her to fall down a flight of stone steps and break her leg in 3 places. The leg never healed properly, leaving her with a permanent limp that ironically made walking in pole lanes even more dangerous. But the injuries weren't just from falling. The shoes themselves were instruments of slow-motion torture. The rigid leather and extreme points forced feet into completely unnatural positions. Toes were crushed together into the narrow points. The arch of the foot was stressed beyond its natural limits. The ankle had to work overtime to compensate for the unnatural weight distribution. Wealthy pole lane wearers developed a host of foot problems that medieval medicine had no idea how to treat. Bunions became infected and turned into open sores. Corns developed on toes crushed into unnatural positions. The constant pressure and friction created calluses so thick they looked like medieval armor plating growing directly out of people's feet. And here's the really twisted part. The wealthy saw these injuries and deformities as badges of honor. Having feet destroyed by fashion was proof that you could afford to prioritize style over function. Limping because of your shoes wasn't embarrassing. It was aristocratic. Being unable to walk properly wasn't a disability. It was a status symbol. Medieval court records are filled with accounts of nobles who bragged about their pole lane-related injuries. They would display their deformed feet like trophies, showing off bunions and scars as evidence of their commitment to high fashion. Some even hired artists to create portraits that specifically featured their damaged feet, immortalizing their suffering in expensive paintings. The most dedicated pole lane enthusiasts developed what we would now recognize as serious mobility disabilities. They couldn't walk more than short distances without severe pain. They required assistance to navigate stairs, uneven ground, or any terrain more challenging than a perfectly flat floor. Some became essentially homebound, unable to leave their residences except in litters or carriages because walking any significant distance was simply impossible. But even then, they didn't abandon their beloved pointed shoes. They just made them more elaborate, more expensive, more impractical. Because in the twisted logic of medieval fashion, if your shoes weren't actively destroying your ability to function as a human being, you clearly weren't wealthy enough to deserve respect. The walking nightmares were just getting started. Number 4. Battlefield disaster. Now let's talk about what happened when medieval warfare met medieval fashion. Because nothing says military disaster quite like trying to fight a battle while wearing shoes that make it impossible to run, dodge, or maintain your balance during combat. You might think that knights and soldiers would have the common sense to leave their ridiculous pointed shoes at home when heading off to war. You would be wrong. The wealthy warriors of medieval Europe were so obsessed with displaying their status that many of them wore polanes into actual combat. The results were about as catastrophic as you'd expect. Picture this: you're a medieval knight trained from childhood in combat, wearing expensive armor, carrying weapons worth more than most people's houses. You've spent years learning how to fight, how to move in heavy mail, how to balance while swinging a sword. You're a professional warrior, a member of the military elite. And you're wearing shoes with points so long they could be used to joust. The problem started before the fighting even began. Medieval battles weren't fought on nice, flat surfaces. Battlefields were muddy, uneven, covered with rocks, holes, and various obstacles that made footing treacherous even in normal shoes. Add 2-foot pointed tips to your footwear, and every step becomes a potential disaster. Knights wearing polanes couldn't charge effectively because they couldn't run. The elaborate points caught in mud, snagged on debris, and threw off their balance with every stride. What should have been a fearsome cavalry charge became an awkward, stumbling advance that gave enemies plenty of time to prepare their defenses. But the real disasters happened during close combat. Medieval fighting required quick footwork, the ability to dodge, pivot, advance, and retreat rapidly. Polanes made all of this impossible. Knights found themselves trapped by their own footwear, unable to maneuver effectively, easy targets for enemies who had the good sense to wear practical shoes. One chronicler describes a battle where several wealthy knights wearing elaborate polanes were easily defeated by common soldiers specifically because they couldn't move properly. The knights' expensive armor and weapons meant nothing when they couldn't dodge attacks or maintain their footing during combat. Their own shoes had turned them into slow-moving, vulnerable targets. The pointed tips became weapons against their own wearers. In the chaos of battle, knights would trip over their own polanes, tangle their feet together, or catch their shoe points on fallen weapons or armor. Some actually impaled their own feet on the sharp points of their shoes while trying to move quickly across uneven ground. Medieval battles were often won or lost based on soldiers' ability to retreat when necessary. A strategic withdrawal could save an army from total destruction. But knights wearing polanes couldn't retreat effectively. They couldn't run away from advancing enemies. They became easy targets for archers, foot soldiers, and enemy cavalry who could simply ride them down because they couldn't move fast enough to escape. The most famous disaster occurred during a battle in France where a group of wealthy knights wearing extremely long polanes were completely routed by a much smaller force of practical-minded soldiers. The knights' elaborate footwear made them so slow and clumsy that they were picked off one by one, unable to fight effectively or flee when the battle turned against them. But even these obvious military disasters didn't convince the wealthy to abandon their beloved pointed shoes. Instead, they developed new strategies that worked around their footwear limitations. Some knights fought from horseback exclusively, never dismounting because walking in polanes was too dangerous. Others hired additional servants to help them move around battlefields, essentially turning warfare into an assisted living situation. The most absurd solution was the development of battle polanes, supposedly more practical versions of the pointed shoes designed specifically for combat. These were shorter, sturdier, and less decorated than regular polanes. But they still had long pointed tips, and they were still completely unsuitable for warfare. It was like trying to make a practical version of a tuxedo for construction work, missing the point entirely. Military commanders began developing battle tactics that accommodated knights wearing polanes. Battle formations were adjusted to account for soldiers who couldn't move quickly. Retreat signals were given earlier to allow polane-wearing warriors extra time to escape. Some armies actually assigned servants to help wealthy knights navigate difficult terrain during battles. The ultimate irony was that the very symbol of medieval nobility and military prowess, the wealthy knight in shining armor, had been rendered nearly helpless by fashion. These professional warriors, trained for combat their entire lives, were being defeated by their own shoes. The Polaine had transformed the military elite from fearsome fighters into walking targets. And yet they kept wearing them. Because even in the face of military disaster, even when their lives were literally at stake, the wealthy couldn't bear to give up the one thing that proved they were better than everyone else, even if that thing was actively trying to kill them. Number 5, the church's condemnation. If you thought the medieval church was going to sit quietly while the wealthy literally destroyed their feet in the name of fashion, you don't know the medieval church. These were the same people who condemned dancing, declared that enjoying your food too much was sinful, and believed that any form of personal vanity was a direct insult to God. Polaines weren't just impractical footwear to them. They were evidence of humanity's corruption, symbols of pride and vanity that were literally leading souls straight to hell. The church's opposition to Polaines wasn't subtle. Priests delivered fiery sermons about the spiritual dangers of pointed shoes. They declared that wearing Polaines was a form of prideful vanity that offended God. Some went further, claiming that the long points were deliberately shaped to resemble devil's horns or demonic claws, making anyone who wore them a servant of Satan. Pope Urban V didn't mess around when it came to Polaines. In 1366, he issued a papal bull specifically condemning pointed shoes, calling them vanity of vanities, and declaring that anyone who wore them was guilty of the sin of pride. He argued that Polaines demonstrated a rejection of God's design for the human foot, an attempt to improve upon divine creation through worldly fashion. But the church's concerns went beyond simple vanity. Medieval religious thinkers saw Polaines as symbols of everything wrong with society. The wealthy's obsession with status over substance, the prioritization of appearance over spiritual health, and the dangerous pursuit of worldly pleasures at the expense of eternal salvation. One particularly dramatic church condemnation came from a bishop who declared that Polaines were shoes for walking on the path to hell. He argued that the extended points literally pointed downward toward the underworld, symbolically directing the wearer's soul toward eternal damnation. This wasn't metaphorical. He genuinely believed that the shape of the shoes was spiritually dangerous. The church also condemned Polaines on practical grounds. How could you kneel properly for prayer when your shoes extended 2 feet in front of your knees? How could you approach the altar for communion without your shoe points knocking over religious artifacts? The very act of worship became complicated when your footwear was longer than most religious books. Medieval churches began posting rules specifically about Polaines. Some banned them entirely from religious services. Others required that Polaine wearers sit in the back rows to avoid disrupting worship with their ridiculous footwear. A few churches actually installed special kneelers with extra space to accommodate the long points, though they made it clear they disapproved of the necessity. But the most serious religious condemnation focused on what Polaines represented, a complete rejection of Christian values of humility, simplicity, and concern for others. The church argued that wearing shoes so impractical that you needed servants to help you walk was the opposite of Christian service. Instead of helping others, Polaine wearers required others to help them, turning themselves into burdens on society. Religious writers produced lengthy treatises explaining why Polaines were spiritually dangerous. They argue that the time and money spent on elaborate footwear could have been used to help the poor, fund religious institutions, or support charitable works. Every gold thread woven into a Polaine was gold that could have fed hungry families. Every hour spent learning to walk in pointed shoes was time that could have been devoted to prayer and spiritual development. The church's campaign against Polaines included some genuinely creative propaganda. Religious artists created paintings and sculptures showing demons and devils wearing elaborate pointed shoes, reinforcing the connection between Polaines and evil. Some churches commissioned stained glass windows depicting the damned in hell, all wearing fashionable Polaines as they suffered eternal torment. One of the most effective anti-Polaine campaigns involved public sermons where priests would bring actual Polaines to church and use them as visual aids while explaining the spiritual dangers of vanity. They would hold up the ridiculous shoes, point to the absurdly long tips, and ask their congregations how anyone could believe that God intended human feet to be trapped in such devices. But here's the thing about trying to shame wealthy people out of their favorite fashion trends. It doesn't work. The church's condemnation just made Polaines more appealing to some wealthy individuals. Being criticized by religious authorities became another form of status symbol, proof that you were important enough for the church to notice and wealthy enough to ignore their disapproval. Some noble families actually increased their Polaine wearing after being condemned by local priests, treating religious criticism as a challenge rather than a warning. They argued that God had given them wealth and status, so displaying that wealth through fashionable footwear was actually honoring divine gifts. The church tried banning pole lanes during religious holidays, threatening excommunication for anyone who wore them to Easter or Christmas services. Some priests refused to perform marriages for couples where either party wore pointed shoes, claiming that starting a marriage while dressed in symbols of vanity was spiritually dangerous. But even these extreme measures had limited success. The wealthy found ways around religious restrictions, removing their pole lanes just before entering churches and putting them back on immediately afterward. Some commissioned special church shoes that were slightly less ridiculous than their regular pole lanes, technically complying with religious rules while still maintaining their fashionable status. The church's failure to stop pole lane fashion revealed something important about medieval society. When religious authority conflicted with social status, status often won. The wealthy were willing to risk their eternal souls rather than give up their ridiculous shoes. And that willingness to prioritize fashion over salvation was about to create even bigger problems. Number 6. Royal restrictions. When church condemnation failed to stop the pole lane madness, medieval rulers decided to step in with the one thing that actually scared wealthy people: legal consequences. But instead of banning pointed shoes entirely, they did something even more twisted. They turned pole lane length into an official marker of social class, creating laws that made your shoe points a legal declaration of your place in society. The first major royal restrictions came from England in the 14th century. King Edward III, apparently tired of watching his nobles stumble around in ridiculous footwear, issued sumptuary laws that regulated exactly how long different classes of people could make their pole lane points. But instead of protecting people from dangerous fashion, these laws actually made pole lanes more desirable by turning them into official status symbols. Here's how the legal system worked. Common people, peasants, and workers were forbidden from wearing pole lanes at all. Their shoes had to be practical, boring, and completely pointless. Literally. Merchants and skilled craftsmen could wear pole lanes with points up to 6 inches long, but no longer. Minor nobles and wealthy landowners could extend their points to 12 inches. Only the highest nobility, the richest families, and members of the royal court were legally allowed to wear pole lanes longer than 12 inches. Think about how insane this system was. The government was literally measuring people's shoes to determine their legal rights and social status. Official shoe inspectors would examine footwear at public gatherings, court sessions, and royal events. Being caught wearing pole lanes longer than your social class allowed could result in fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. But the restrictions backfired spectacularly. Instead of reducing pole lane wearing, they made extreme pointed shoes more desirable than ever. Now, it wasn't enough to simply wear ridiculous footwear. You had to wear the longest, most extreme pole lanes legally possible for your social class. Every inch of shoe point became a visible declaration of your wealth and status. The laws created a black market for illegal pole lanes. Wealthy merchants who legally could only wear 6-inch points would secretly commission 12-inch or 18-inch pole lanes, hiding them at home and wearing them to private gatherings where shoe inspectors weren't present. Some developed elaborate schemes for quickly switching between legal and illegal footwear, depending on where they were going. Royal enforcement became increasingly ridiculous. King Charles V of France issued detailed regulations specifying not just the maximum length of pole lanes for each social class, but also their width, the materials that could be used, and the types of decorations that were permitted. Court officials were assigned to measure shoes and ensure compliance with royal shoe laws. The most absurd enforcement came from Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who created an official position called the Inspector of Points, a government employee whose entire job was examining people's shoes and ensuring they weren't wearing points longer than their social status allowed. This person had the legal authority to arrest people for shoe crimes. But wealthy people found creative ways around the restrictions. Some commissioned pole lanes with removable tips that could be quickly detached when officials were around. Others wore specially designed overshoes with legal length points that could be worn over their illegal longer pole lanes. A few wealthy families hired servants to carry extra shoes, allowing for quick changes when law enforcement appeared. The legal restrictions also created new forms of social competition. Nobles would try to obtain official permits for longer pole lane points, bribing court officials, or performing favors for royal families in exchange for upgraded shoe privileges. Some spent more money on legal fees trying to extend their permitted pole lane length than they spent on the actual shoes. Royal courts became battlegrounds over shoe rights. Noble families would petition kings and queens for permission to wear longer points, claiming their loyalty, service, or wealth entitled them to more extreme pole lanes. Court records from the period are filled with formal requests for shoe upgrades, appeals of pole lane violations, and legal disputes over who was allowed to wear what length of points. The enforcement created a cottage industry of legal expertise. Lawyers specialized in sumptuary law, helping wealthy clients navigate the complex regulations around pointed shoes. Some became experts at arguing technicalities, claiming that certain measurements should start from different parts of the foot, or that decorative elements shouldn't count toward official length limits. But the most twisted aspect of royal restrictions was how they turned pollain wearing into a form of legal rebellion. Wealthy people who might have eventually grown tired of uncomfortable shoes now saw them as symbols of resistance against government overreach. Wearing illegally long pollains became an act of defiance against royal authority. Some noble families made careers out of flaunting shoe laws, becoming famous throughout Europe for their commitment to wearing the longest possible pollains regardless of legal consequences. They paid fines cheerfully, treating them as a luxury tax on extreme fashion. They hired lawyers to appeal shoe violations, turning courtrooms into battlegrounds over footwear rights. The ultimate irony was that royal restrictions, intended to reduce the social damage caused by pollain fashion, actually made the problem worse. By making extreme pointed shoes into official status symbols protected by law, rulers guaranteed that wealthy people would never voluntarily abandon them. The government had essentially created a legal framework that encouraged dangerous fashion, and the wealthy loved every minute of it. Number 7. Medical nightmares. Now let's talk about what pollains actually did to the human body. Because while the social and legal drama was entertaining, the medical reality was horrifying. We're talking about a fashion trend that systematically destroyed people's feet, legs, and spines over the course of decades, creating disabilities and deformities that medieval medicine had no idea how to treat. The problem started with basic foot anatomy. Human feet are designed to distribute weight evenly across a relatively wide surface area. The toes spread naturally to provide balance and stability. The arch provides spring and shock absorption. The ankle allows for natural movement and adjustment to uneven surfaces. Pollains destroyed all of this. The narrow, pointed tips of pollains forced all 5 toes into an unnaturally compressed space. Imagine shoving your entire foot into a cone-shaped container and then trying to walk around for 12 hours a day. The toes were crushed together, overlapping and pushing against each other in ways human anatomy was never designed to handle. This constant compression led to what medieval physicians called noble rot, a condition where the toes develop severe bunions, corns, and open sores from being pressed together. The skin between the toes would break down from constant friction, creating wounds that couldn't heal because the pressure never stopped. Some wealthy pollain wearers developed infections so severe that their toes literally rotted off while they were still alive. But the toe damage was just the beginning. The extreme points of pollains forced the entire foot into an unnatural position. The arch was compressed and flattened, destroying the natural spring mechanism that makes normal walking possible. The ankle had to work overtime to compensate for the changed weight distribution, leading to chronic pain and joint damage. Long-term pollain wearing created what we would now recognize as serious deformities. Feet became permanently narrowed and elongated. Toes fused together from constant pressure. The natural curve of the foot flattened into an unnatural straight line that made walking painful even when not wearing shoes. Medieval records describe wealthy individuals whose feet had become so deformed by pollains that they couldn't wear normal shoes at all. Their feet were permanently shaped to fit inside pointed shoes, with toes that could no longer spread naturally and arches that had completely collapsed. They had essentially transformed their feet into the shape of their footwear, creating permanent disabilities in the name of fashion. The problems weren't limited to feet. The unnatural posture required to walk in pollains affected the entire body. The hips had to adjust to compensate for the changed foot position. The spine curved unnaturally to maintain balance. The shoulders hunched forward to help with stability. Long-term pollain wearers developed a distinctive posture that screamed, "My shoes have destroyed my body." Medieval physicians reported an epidemic of spinal problems among wealthy pollain enthusiasts. The constant strain of maintaining balance while wearing impractical footwear led to chronic back pain, disc problems, and permanent spinal curvature. Some wealthy individuals became hunchbacked specifically from decades of trying to walk in pointed shoes. The medical establishment, such as it was in medieval times, had no idea how to treat pollain-related injuries. They tried bloodletting, herbal treatments, and prayer, but nothing could reverse the permanent damage caused by years of foot compression and postural compensation. Medieval medicine, wasn't equipped to handle disabilities created by voluntary self-mutilation in the name of fashion. Some of the most gruesome medical accounts describe attempts to treat severely infected feet in wealthy Polaine wearers. Medieval surgeons would attempt to drain infected bunions or remove rotted toes, but without proper antiseptics or surgical techniques, these procedures often led to even more severe infections. Some patients died from infections that started as simple shoe-related foot problems. The psychological impact was also significant. Wealthy individuals who had spent decades wearing Polaines often became obsessed with hiding their deformed feet. They would wear special socks or wrappings to disguise the shape of their toes. Some became reclusive, ashamed of what their pursuit of fashion had done to their bodies. But here's the most twisted part. Even when faced with obvious medical evidence that Polaines were destroying their bodies, many wealthy people refused to stop wearing them. They treated their deformities and disabilities as acceptable prices to pay for social status. Some actually bragged about their foot damage, displaying their bunions and scars as evidence of their commitment to high fashion. Medieval physicians began writing treatises specifically about the medical dangers of Polaines, describing in detail the foot damage, spinal problems, and infections they were seeing in wealthy patients. But these medical warnings were largely ignored by the very people who needed to hear them most. The medical community tried various approaches to convince people to abandon Polaines. They created illustrations showing healthy feet versus Polaine-damaged feet. They wrote detailed descriptions of the pain and disability that long-term Polaine wearing would cause. They even tried appealing to vanity, arguing that deformed feet were actually unattractive and socially damaging. Nothing worked. The wealthy had become so psychologically invested in their pointed shoes that they were willing to accept permanent disability rather than abandon their status symbols. The medical nightmares created by Polaines had become normalized, treated as acceptable consequences of maintaining social rank. Some wealthy families developed elaborate systems for managing their Polaine-related medical problems. They hired personal physicians whose primary job was treating foot infections and managing pain. They employed servants specifically trained to help with the daily care of damaged feet. They commissioned special furniture designed to accommodate people whose spinal curvature made normal sitting impossible. The most extreme cases required constant medical attention. Some wealthy Polaine enthusiasts needed daily foot care to prevent infections from becoming life-threatening. Others required custom-made mobility aids to help them walk without falling. A few became completely bedridden, their bodies so damaged by decades of fashionable footwear that they could no longer support their own weight. But even from their beds, they continued to wear Polaines. Even when they could barely walk, they insisted on maintaining their fashion statements. Even when their feet were wrapped in bandages to treat infections, they demanded that the bandages be covered by pointed shoes. The medical nightmares had become so normalized that they were just another aspect of wealthy life, like having servants or owning land. The truly tragic part is that these medical disasters were completely preventable. All the pain, deformity, and disability could have been avoided simply by wearing normal, comfortable shoes. But the social pressure to maintain status through extreme fashion was so powerful that wealthy people chose permanent physical damage rather than social embarrassment. And the medical profession of the time, limited though it was, had no legal power to intervene. They could document the damage, describe the problems, and warn about the consequences, but they couldn't force their wealthy patients to prioritize their health over their social standing. The medical nightmares continued, one destroyed foot at a time. Number 8. The joke of the streets. While the wealthy elite were busy crippling themselves with pointed shoes, the common people of medieval Europe were watching this spectacle with a mixture of horror, amusement, and barely contained laughter. The peasants, workers, and ordinary citizens who couldn't afford Polaines had front-row seats to one of history's most ridiculous fashion disasters, and they were not impressed. The mockery started almost immediately after Polaines became popular among the wealthy. Common people who wore practical leather boots designed for actual work couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily make walking difficult. They watched wealthy nobles stumble through streets, trip over their own feet, and require assistance with basic mobility, and they came to an obvious conclusion. Rich people had lost their minds. Street humor in medieval times was brutal and unforgiving. Peasants and workers developed an entire comedy routine around Polaine-wearing nobility. They would imitate the awkward Polaine shuffle, exaggerating the careful mincing steps required to walk in pointed shoes. They created mock dances that highlighted how ridiculous the wealthy looked while trying to move normally. The jokes weren't just physical comedy. Common people developed elaborate verbal mockery specifically targeting Polaine wearers. They called them point-foots, devil toes, and spike-walkers. Some of the most popular insults compared wealthy Polaine enthusiasts to various animals known for awkward movement, comparing them to penguins waddling across ice or to roosters prancing around on their toes. The rooster comparison became particularly popular because roosters were seen as vain, proud, and ridiculous, exactly how common people viewed wealthy Polaine wearers. Street performers would dress up like wealthy nobles with exaggerated pointed shoes and strut around like roosters, complete with exaggerated head movements and awkward steps. These performances were hugely popular with common audiences who enjoyed seeing the wealthy mocked. But the mockery went deeper than simple entertainment. Common people saw Polaines as symbols of everything wrong with the wealthy class. Here were people who had so much money and so much time that they could afford to make their lives deliberately difficult. While peasants struggled with real problems, hunger, disease, backbreaking labor, the wealthy were creating artificial problems by wearing shoes that made walking impossible. The practical-minded common folk couldn't understand the logic. They would openly wonder why anyone would choose to wear shoes that made it impossible to work, fight, or even walk properly. From their perspective, Polaines weren't just impractical, they were insane. The wealthy were voluntarily disabling themselves for no reason that made sense to people who valued functionality over fashion. Street vendors and market sellers had particular fun with Polaine wearers. They would watch wealthy customers try to navigate crowded marketplaces in their pointed shoes, tripping over produce, knocking over displays, and generally creating chaos wherever they went. The vendors learned to clear extra space around Polaine-wearing customers, not out of respect, but to prevent their merchandise from being destroyed by flailing pointed shoes. The mockery became institutionalized in medieval folk culture. Popular songs mocked Polaine wearers, describing their awkward movements and frequent falls. Street performers created comedy acts specifically about the absurdity of pointed shoes. Even children's games involved pretending to wear invisible Polaines and stumbling around dramatically. One particularly popular form of mockery involved common people pretending to wear extremely long Polaines made from sticks, rags, or other improvised materials. They would attach these fake pointed shoes and then parade around in exaggerated imitation of wealthy fashion, deliberately falling down, getting tangled up, and generally highlighting how ridiculous the whole concept was. The wealthy were generally aware of this mockery, and it stung more than they liked to admit. Being laughed at by people they considered social inferiors was deeply humiliating. Some nobles tried to avoid areas where common people congregated, limiting their public appearances to venues where mockery was less likely. But the mockery also had an unintended consequence. It made Polaines even more appealing to some wealthy individuals. Being mocked by common people became another form of status symbol, proof that they were so far above ordinary concerns that ordinary people couldn't understand their lifestyle choices. Some nobles actually enjoyed the fact that their fashion choices were so extreme that they provoked public reaction. The most cutting mockery focused on the practical implications of Polaine wearing. Common people would joke about wealthy nobles needing help to use the bathroom, requiring assistance to get dressed, and being unable to respond to emergencies because of their impractical footwear. These jokes hit particularly hard because they were largely true. Street performers developed elaborate comedy routines about wealthy Polaine wearers trying to perform simple tasks, climbing stairs, picking up dropped objects, or walking through doorways. These performances were funny precisely because they weren't exaggerated. Wealthy people really did struggle with these basic activities because of their footwear choices. The mockery extended to the servants and attendants who had to help Polaine wearers navigate daily life. Common people joked about shoe servants, whose job was preventing their employers from falling over. They made fun of the elaborate systems wealthy people developed to cope with their self-imposed disabilities. But perhaps the most devastating mockery focused on the obvious contradiction between Polaines and practical life. Common people would joke about what would happen if wealthy Polaine wearers ever had to do real work, face real danger, or deal with real problems. The jokes were cruel but accurate. People wearing impractical pointed shoes were completely unprepared for any situation that required normal human mobility. The street mockeries serve an important social function, providing a way for powerless common people to critique and comment on the behavior of their social superiors. Through humor, they could point out the absurdity and waste of extreme wealth without directly challenging the social order that kept them in poverty. And deep down, even the wealthy knew the jokes were justified. They were spending fortunes to make themselves less capable, less mobile, and less functional as human beings. When you looked at it objectively, it really was ridiculous. But they couldn't admit that without admitting that their entire lifestyle was built on absurd priorities and wasteful spending. So they endured the mockery, wore their pointed shoes with as much dignity as they could manage, and tried to pretend that being laughed at by everyone around them was actually a sign of their sophisticated superiority. Number 9. Deadly symbol of pride. By the late medieval period, Polaines had evolved into something far more dangerous than just impractical footwear. They had become symbols of a social system so obsessed with status and hierarchy that wealthy people were literally willing to die rather than appear ordinary. The pointed shoes represented everything toxic about extreme inequality, unchecked vanity, and the deadly consequences of prioritizing appearance over survival. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Every aspect of Polaine culture demonstrated that the wealthy value their social status more than their physical health, their safety, or even their lives. The longer and more impractical the points, the clearer the message. I am so far above practical concerns that I can afford to be completely helpless. This wasn't just personal vanity, it was systematic social dysfunction. When the ruling class of society voluntarily disables itself with fashion accessories, something has gone fundamentally wrong with that society's priorities and values. Polaines represented a civilization that had become so obsessed with artificial markers of status that it had lost sight of actual human welfare. The deadly symbolism was reinforced by the elaborate rituals surrounding Polaine culture. Wealthy families would hold ceremonies to celebrate their children's first pair of pointed shoes, treating foot crippling as a rite of passage into the upper class. They would commission portraits showing off their most extreme Polaines, immortalizing their voluntary self-harm in expensive artwork. The most twisted aspect was how Polaine culture turned suffering into a virtue. The more pain you could endure while wearing pointed shoes, the more admirable you were considered. The more your feet were deformed by fashion, the more sophisticated you appeared. The more difficulty you had walking, the more obvious it was that you didn't need to walk like common people. This created a feedback loop of competitive self-destruction. As some wealthy individuals demonstrated their status by enduring extreme discomfort, others felt pressure to endure even more extreme discomfort to maintain their social position. The culture rewarded escalating self-harm, creating a system where the most successful people were also the most physically damaged. The deadly symbolism extended to how Polaine wearers treated their own bodies. They learned to ignore pain, dismiss infections, and accept deformities as normal parts of life. This wasn't just about shoes, it was about developing a mindset that treated personal suffering as acceptable if it maintained social status. Medieval moralists recognized the broader implications of Polaine culture. They saw pointed shoes as symptoms of a society that had become completely disconnected from practical reality. When your ruling class spends its time learning to walk in impractical footwear instead of learning to govern effectively, your civilization has serious problems. The deadly pride represented by Polaines also affected military preparedness. A warrior class that couldn't run, couldn't fight effectively, and couldn't respond quickly to emergencies was a threat to national security. Some military analysts argued that Polaine-wearing nobility had become so physically compromised that they were no longer capable of defending their territories. The economic implications were equally serious. Wealthy families were spending enormous amounts of money on footwear that made them less productive, less mobile, and less capable of managing their estates and businesses effectively. The pursuit of fashionable status symbols was literally reducing their ability to generate the wealth that supported their lifestyles. But perhaps the most deadly aspect of Polaine symbolism was how it normalized the idea that suffering for appearance was noble and admirable. This mindset extended beyond footwear into other areas of life, creating a culture where wealthy people competed to demonstrate their status through various forms of voluntary hardship and self-limitation. The psychological damage was profound. Wealthy individuals who had spent decades wearing Polaines often developed distorted relationships with their own bodies, treating physical pain and limitation as normal and acceptable. They lost the ability to recognize when their pursuit of status was genuinely harming their health and well-being. The social pressure was so intense that some wealthy people continued wearing Polaines even when their physicians explicitly warned that continued use would result in serious disability or death. The fear of social embarrassment was literally stronger than the fear of permanent physical damage. This created a culture of mutual enablement, where wealthy people supported each other's self-destructive fashion choices rather than acknowledging the obvious problems. Families would celebrate members who endure the most extreme Polaines, treating their suffering as evidence of superior character and commitment to social excellence. The deadly symbolism of Polaines also reinforced class divisions in dangerous ways. By making mobility and physical capability markers of lower social status, Polaine culture created a system where being healthy and functional was seen as embarrassing and common. This inverted normal human values, making weakness desirable and strength shameful. The ultimate symbol of this deadly pride was the fact that many wealthy Polaine wearers preferred to die rather than abandon their pointed shoes. Historical records document cases of individuals who literally chose death over the social humiliation of wearing practical footwear. Their pointed shoes had become more important to them than their own lives. The legacy of this deadly symbolism extended far beyond medieval Europe. Polaines established a template for fashion-based self-harm that would recur throughout history. The idea that true sophistication requires suffering, that real status demands sacrifice, and that appearance matters more than health, safety, or survival. In the end, Polaines represented the ultimate triumph of social pride over human instinct, of artificial status over natural well-being, of deadly symbolism over life itself. Number 10. The strange legacy. You might think that once medieval Europe finally came to its senses about pointed shoes, the world would learn its lesson about prioritizing fashion over function. You would be wrong. The Polaine phenomenon didn't just fade away. It left behind a twisted legacy that continues to influence fashion, culture, and human behavior right up to the present day. The most obvious legacy is in our modern shoe industry. Walk into any upscale shoe store today, and you'll find plenty of footwear that prioritizes appearance over comfort, health, or practicality. High heels that destroy feet and spines. Narrow-toed dress shoes that compress feet into unnatural shapes. Fashion boots with impractical heights and unstable platforms. The spirit of the Polaine lives on in every shoe designed to look impressive rather than feel comfortable. But the Polaine legacy goes deeper than just uncomfortable footwear. It established a template for what we now call luxury suffering, the idea that true status requires enduring discomfort, inconvenience, or even pain to demonstrate your wealth and sophistication. This mindset shows up everywhere in modern high-end fashion and lifestyle culture. Consider the modern fashion industry's obsession with impractical clothing. Haute couture dresses so elaborate they require teams of assistants to help the wearer move. Designer bags so small they can't hold anything useful but cost thousands of dollars. Jewelry so heavy and unwieldy that it limits the wearer's movement. All of these follow the Polaine principle. The more impractical the item, the more it demonstrates the owner's wealth and status. The psychological legacy is equally important. Polaines helped establish the idea that suffering for appearance is noble, admirable, and socially desirable. This mindset drove centuries of dangerous beauty practices, from lead-based makeup that poisoned users to corsets so tight they damaged internal organs to modern procedures like extreme plastic surgery and dangerous diet practices. The competitive aspect of Polaine culture also established patterns that continue today. Just as medieval nobles competed to wear the longest, most impractical points, modern consumers compete to own the most expensive, exclusive, or status-signaling items. The specific objects change, but the underlying psychology remains the same, using material possessions to demonstrate social superiority, even when those possessions are harmful or ridiculous. Fashion historians trace a direct line from medieval Polaines to various later fashion trends that prioritized appearance over health. The Renaissance chopans, platform shoes, so high they required servants to help wearers walk. The 18th century powdered wigs so elaborate they harbored insects and required constant maintenance. The Victorian bustles so large they made sitting impossible. Each of these trends follow the Polaine model. Take a basic item of clothing, make it so extreme that it becomes impractical, then use that impracticality as proof of wealth and status. The more inconvenient your fashion choices, the more obvious it became that you could afford to be inconvenienced. The modern high heel industry owes a particular debt to Polaine culture. Like pointed shoes, high heels serve no practical purpose and actively harm the wearer's health. They cause foot deformities, spinal problems, and mobility limitations remarkably similar to those caused by Polaines. Yet they remain popular specifically because they signal that the wearer doesn't need to prioritize comfort or practicality. The business world adopted Polaine principles in unexpected ways. The modern concept of luxury often relies on impracticality as a marker of exclusivity. Expensive sports cars with such low ground clearance they can't navigate normal streets. Designer furniture so delicate it can't be used for its intended purpose. Technology products with form factors that sacrifice functionality for appearance. Even modern architecture shows Palladian influence. Buildings designed to look impressive rather than function well for their users. Public spaces that prioritize photogenic appearances over practical usability. Urban planning that creates beautiful vistas while making daily life more difficult for residents. The social media age has given new life to Palladian-style thinking. The pressure to create visually impressive content often leads people to make impractical or even dangerous choices. Fashion influencers wear outfits so elaborate they can barely move. Travel bloggers visit locations specifically because they look good in photos, regardless of whether the experience is enjoyable or meaningful. But perhaps the strangest legacy is how Palladian culture predicted modern attitudes toward health, safety, and risk assessment. Medieval Palladian wearers systematically ignored medical evidence, dismissed practical concerns, and prioritized social signaling over personal welfare. This pattern of behavior shows up repeatedly in modern context, from people who choose dangerous beauty procedures to those who ignore health warnings about trendy lifestyle choices. The environmental implications are also significant. Palladian culture established the precedent for treating fashion as disposable, wasteful, and divorced from practical considerations. Modern fast fashion, with its emphasis on constantly changing trends regardless of environmental cost, follows the same basic logic that drove medieval pointed shoe culture. The gender implications have persisted as well. Just as medieval Palladians were often more extreme and more damaging for women than for men, modern fashion continues to place greater pressure on women to prioritize appearance over comfort, health, or practicality. The expectation that women should suffer for beauty has direct roots in medieval status culture. The most troubling legacy may be how Palladian culture normalized the idea that questioning fashion choices is unsophisticated or lower class. Medieval nobles dismissed criticism of their pointed shoes as evidence that critics didn't understand true sophistication. This same dismissive attitude appears whenever anyone questions whether modern fashion trends are worth their health costs or practical limitations. The strange truth is that we never really moved beyond Palladian thinking. We just transferred the same basic mindset to different objects and different forms of status competition. The specific symbols change, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably consistent. The belief that true sophistication requires suffering, that real status demands impracticality, and that appearance matters more than health, comfort, or common sense. In the end, the legacy of Palladians isn't really about shoes at all. It's about a way of thinking about status, fashion, and human priorities that has persisted for over 700 years. Every time someone chooses to endure discomfort for the sake of appearance, every time someone prioritizes looking impressive over feeling good, every time someone dismisses practical concerns in favor of social signaling, they're following in the footsteps of medieval nobles stumbling through cobblestone streets in their deadly pointed shoes. The Palladians are gone, but the mindset that created them lives on. And until we learn to value health, comfort, and practical wisdom over status and appearance, we'll keep creating new versions of the same old deadly shoes, just with different shapes and different names. So the next time you see someone struggling in impractical fashion choices, remember the pointed shoes of medieval Europe. Remember that this pattern has been with us for centuries. And maybe, just maybe, consider whether comfort and health might be more important than looking impressive. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the most fashionable choice isn't always the smartest choice. And sometimes, the deadliest shoes are the ones that look the most impressive. And with that thought, we've walked through the complete, twisted history of fashion's most dangerous footwear. From obsession to legislation, from medical disaster to social mockery, the story of Palladians reminds us that human vanity can be literally deadly and that we're still walking in those same dangerous footsteps today, just with different shoes. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's most impractical fashion statement. If you learned something new about how far people will go in the name of style, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's strangest and most cautionary tales. And remember, sometimes the most important lesson from the past is knowing when to choose comfort over fashion, health over status, and common sense over deadly shoes. And here we are, at the end of our journey through one of history's most absurd and deadly fashion trends. We've watched wealthy medieval Europeans voluntarily cripple themselves with pointed shoes, ignore medical warnings, defy religious condemnation, break laws, endure mockery, and literally choose death over practical footwear. We've seen how a simple fashion accessory became a symbol of everything wrong with extreme inequality, unchecked vanity, and the human capacity for self-destruction in the name of social status. But if you think this story is just about ridiculous medieval people doing ridiculous medieval things, you're missing the point entirely. The story of Polaines isn't really about shoes at all. It's about us. It's about human nature, social psychology, and the patterns of behavior that keep repeating throughout history, no matter how much we think we've evolved. Think about it. Right now, as you're listening to this, millions of people around the world are making choices that prioritize appearance over health, status over comfort, and social signaling over personal well-being. The specific objects might have changed, but the underlying psychology is identical to those medieval nobles stumbling through cobblestone streets in their deadly pointed shoes. Consider modern high heels. They serve no practical purpose, cause documented foot deformities, spinal problems, and mobility issues, and yet they remain standard professional attire for women in many industries. Sound familiar? The same competitive pressure that drove medieval nobles to wear longer and longer Polaine points now drives people to wear higher and higher heels, despite the obvious health consequences. Or think about modern luxury culture. People spend thousands of dollars on handbags so small they can't hold anything useful, cars so low they can't navigate normal streets, or clothing so delicate it can't be worn in normal situations. Then practicality isn't a bug, it's a feature. Just like with Polaines, the inability to use these expensive items for their supposed purpose is exactly what makes them valuable as status symbols. The cosmetic surgery industry follows the same pattern. People endure pain, risk serious complications, and sometimes die pursuing appearance modifications that serve no practical purpose beyond social signaling. The more extreme and obvious the modification, the clearer the message that the person can afford to prioritize appearance over health and safety. Even in areas that seem completely unrelated to fashion, we see Polaine style thinking everywhere. Social media culture encourages people to make impractical or dangerous choices specifically because they create impressive visual content. The pressure to appear successful, attractive, or interesting online drives behavior that mirrors medieval nobles competing over shoe point length. The technology industry capitalizes on this psychology by creating products that prioritize form over function. Phones so thin they break easily. Laptops so slim they overheat. Cars with interfaces so complex they're dangerous to operate. Then practicality becomes a selling point because it demonstrates that the user values appearance over practicality. But perhaps the most troubling parallel is how modern consumers, just like medieval Polaine wearers, systematically ignore evidence that their choices are harmful. We have extensive research on health effects of high heels, the environmental costs of fast fashion, the psychological damage of social media, and the financial risks of status-driven spending. Yet people continue making these choices, dismissing concerns just as medieval nobles dismissed warnings about their pointed shoes. The normalization process is identical, too. Just as medieval society came to see foot deformities and mobility problems as acceptable prices to pay for social status, modern society normalizes various forms of self-harm in the name of appearance, success, or social acceptance. We've learned to treat suffering for status as admirable rather than concerning. The social pressure mechanisms haven't changed either. Medieval nobles couldn't abandon Polaines without losing social status, just as modern people often can't abandon harmful fashion or lifestyle choices without facing social or professional consequences. The fear of being seen as unsophisticated, unsuccessful, or lower-class drives continued participation in systems that everyone knows are problematic. Even the enablement patterns persist. Medieval wealthy families celebrated members who endure the most extreme Polaines, just as modern culture celebrates people who make the most extreme sacrifices for appearance, career success, or social media presence. We've learned to treat self-destructive dedication as admirable rather than concerning. The economic exploitation is remarkably similar too. Medieval shoemakers profited from wealthy people's willingness to pay enormous sums for impractical footwear, just as modern industries profit from consumers' willingness to pay premium prices for items that are deliberately designed to be impractical, uncomfortable, or short-lived. But here's what's really disturbing about the Polaine parallel. We actually know better. We have centuries of historical evidence about the dangers of prioritizing fashion over function. We have advanced medical knowledge about the health consequences of various choices. We have psychological research about the futility of status-based competition. We have economic data about the waste involved in conspicuous consumption. Medieval nobles could claim ignorance. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't have access to modern medical knowledge. They didn't know about the psychological principles that drive status competition. We don't have those excuses. We know exactly what we're doing and why it's harmful, and we do it anyway. This suggests that the Polaine phenomenon reveals something fundamental about human psychology that transcends historical periods, cultural contexts, and available knowledge. It shows us that humans are willing to harm themselves in predictable ways when the right social pressures are applied, regardless of how much evidence exists about the negative consequences. The competitive aspect is particularly revealing. Polaines demonstrated that when status is based on demonstrating superiority over others, there's no natural stopping point. The competition escalates until it becomes genuinely dangerous or impossible to continue. We see this same pattern in modern contexts, from academic pressure that drives students to dangerous extremes, to work cultures that normalize health-destroying schedules, to social media competition that drives increasingly risky behavior. But perhaps the most important lesson from Polaines is about the role of social systems in enabling harmful behavior. Individual medieval nobles weren't uniquely stupid or vain. They were responding rationally to the incentives and pressures of their social environment. When a society rewards impractical choices and punishes practical ones, people will make impractical choices. This means that addressing modern versions of Polaine-style problems requires looking beyond individual choices to the social, economic, and cultural systems that create pressure for harmful behavior. Just as medieval sumptuary laws failed because they reinforced rather than challenged the underlying status system, modern approaches that focus only on individual responsibility will fail to address systemic problems. The Polaine story also reveals how difficult it is to change established patterns of harmful behavior, even when the problems are obvious. It took over 300 years for European society to abandon pointed shoes, and only then because other fashion trends replaced them, not because people suddenly developed better judgment about prioritizing health over status. This historical perspective should make us humble about our ability to resist similar pressures in modern contexts. It's easy to look at medieval Polaine wearers and feel superior, thinking we would never be so foolish. But the evidence suggests we're making remarkably similar choices, just with different objects and different justifications. The most hopeful aspect of the Polaine story is that these harmful patterns eventually do end. European society did eventually move beyond pointed shoes. The specific mechanisms that created Polaine culture, extreme inequality, rigid social hierarchy, and limited social mobility were gradually modified by historical changes that reduced the pressure for status-based competition. This suggests that modern versions of Polaine-style problems aren't inevitable or permanent. They're products of specific social conditions that can be changed. But change requires recognizing the patterns, understanding the underlying psychology, and deliberately creating social systems that reward healthy choices rather than harmful ones. The Polaine phenomenon also shows us that humans are remarkably adaptable, both in negative and positive directions. Medieval people learned to normalize foot deformities and mobility problems as acceptable consequences of fashionable living. But they also eventually learned to value comfort, practicality, and health over status display. If they could make that transition, so can we. But perhaps the most important message from this historical deep dive is about the power of questioning social norms that everyone takes for granted. Medieval Polaine culture seemed normal and reasonable to the people living within it. The wealthy genuinely believed they were making sophisticated, admirable choices by wearing impractical shoes. It was only with historical distance that the absurdity and harm became obvious. This should make us curious about which of our current normal behaviors will seem as absurd to future generations as Polaines seem to us. What are we doing right now that prioritizes appearance over health, status over well-being, social signaling over practical benefit? What harmful patterns are we participating in because they seem normal within our current social context? The Polaine story teaches us to be suspicious of any system that asks us to harm ourselves for the benefit of appearing sophisticated, successful, or socially acceptable. It shows us that the most dangerous trends are often the ones that everyone agrees are normal and necessary. It reminds us that social pressure can make almost any harmful behavior seem reasonable and desirable. Most importantly, it shows us that humans have always had the capacity to choose differently. Medieval people weren't trapped by their genetics or their historical period. They were trapped by social systems that they had created and that they could have changed. The same is true for us. Every time you choose comfort over appearance, health over status, or practical benefit over social signaling, you're making a choice that medieval Polaine wearers couldn't or wouldn't make. Every time you question whether a popular trend is actually worth its costs, you're exercising a kind of wisdom that could have prevented centuries of foot deformities and fashionable suffering. The pointed shoes are gone, but the choice remains. We can continue following social pressures toward harmful behavior, or we can learn from history's most ridiculous fashion disaster and choose differently. We can prioritize our actual well-being over our perceived status. We can value substance over appearance. We can choose shoes that actually fit our feet, both literally and metaphorically. Because in the end, that's what the Polaine story is really about, the eternal human choice between fitting into harmful systems or having the courage to walk a different path. Medieval Europe eventually learned to make that choice. The question is, will we? The next time you're tempted to prioritize how something looks over how it feels, remember the wealthy nobles of medieval Europe, stumbling through their daily lives in shoes that were slowly destroying their bodies, convinced they were making sophisticated choices while everyone around them could see the obvious problems. Remember that fashion fades, but the damage can last a lifetime. Remember that true sophistication isn't about following trends or impressing others. It's about making choices that support your actual well-being and allow you to live as a fully functional human being. Remember that every generation thinks it's too smart to fall for the obvious mistakes of the past, and every generation finds new ways to make the same fundamental errors in judgment. But most importantly, remember that you have a choice. You don't have to participate in systems that ask you to harm yourself for social acceptance. You don't have to prioritize appearance over health, status over comfort, or social signaling over practical benefit. You can choose to learn from history's most dangerous shoes. You can choose to walk away from deadly fashion trends, both literal and metaphorical. You can choose to value your actual well-being over other people's perceptions of your status. You can choose shoes that fit. And that choice, made by enough people, could eventually create a world where future historians won't have to write cautionary tales about our generation's version of deadly fashion trends. A world where people prioritize health over appearance, substance over status, and practical wisdom over social pressure. The Polaines are gone. The choice remains. What will you choose? Thanks for walking through this dark chapter of fashion history with me. If this deep dive into humanity's capacity for fashionable self-destruction has given you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of the strange, cautionary, and surprisingly relevant lessons hidden in history's strangest moments. And remember, the most important lesson from the past might just be learning when to choose comfort over fashion, health over status, and common sense over deadly shoes. Because sometimes, the best fashion statement is simply taking care of yourself. Until next time, keep your feet happy and your choices practical. History is watching.